Hello everybody and welcome back to Human Systems Engineering 542. Today we'll be talking about usability testing. This is part 2 of our usability evaluation section. You might recall that the first part had to do with inspection methods, and the second part will be about usability testing. All of those things are part of usability evaluation. I thought it might make sense to give you a little bit of background first, though. Part of what we're doing is something called user-centered design. And user-centered design, of course, places the user right smack dab in the middle of our design process, because that's really who we're trying to accommodate. That's really who we're trying to design for. It really has 3 tenets that are worth keeping track of, and in fact, you'll probably notice that almost all kinds of design processes that are user-centered in any way, that includes Agile and other kinds of design processes, usually have these 3 tenets. The first is it involves an early and constant focus on the users of the product. So that focus includes a focus on their goals and their needs and their tasks and their environments in which they do these tasks, as well as the people's capabilities and their limitations. We need to know all of those kinds of things about the user in order to design well for them. The second part, and I should mention also about that first part, is it's both early and constant. It has to start early on in the design process, and you can't lose sight of that focus on those users at any point throughout the development process. The second part is using data to guide design decisions. This is pure and simple empiricism. This is the notion of, yes, we can use our intuition, and our intuition is going to help quite a bit when we're coming into the design of products. On the other hand, to really know what we're doing and to have a good understanding about what sort of design decisions to make, which of 2 reasonable designs to choose from, we should be using data to help us figure that out. And lots of times we get those data through usability testing, and that's what we'll be talking about today. And then the third is iteration. That is, once we have a prototype and we conduct a usability test on that prototype, well, we're going to find problems. We're going to find issues that cause confusion for the user and that kind of thing. And it's now our job to go through and design that confusion out. Then we go back through and we do usability testing again. We might even find that we've introduced a new problem when we redesigned out the old problem. But that's what the iteration is involved in. So we'll design, we'll test, we'll take the information from the test, we'll go back and redesign, we'll test, and we might do that a few times. And the idea here is to do it quickly. It used to be that iteration was a real problem when it came to design, and it took a long time to do each iteration. But now with our prototyping tools and 3D printing tools and all of those kinds of things, we can iterate really fast. And in fact, the more information we get through usability testing, basically the faster the process is, simply because we have kind of a better idea of where we're designing towards. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of this a little bit. You can recall from our last presentation, we talked about usability evaluation in general, and then talked about 2 types of usability evaluation. One was analytic, that is, it didn't use users, and it wasn't gathering data, so to speak. And here that included usability inspection methods like cognitive walkthroughs and heuristic evaluations. We also mentioned that those are kind of discount usability methods, that is, you could do them really fast and relatively cheaply, and that was wonderful. This is more the empirical side of this thing, and this is involving usability testing. And usability testing is really the gold standard for usability evaluation. It takes more time, it's probably a bit more costly, but it's really getting the product in front of the users so that they can perform real honest-to-goodness tasks with them. So that's by that I mean we don't just put it in front of a user and ask them what they think. Instead, we put it in front of a user, give them tasks, and actually ask them to conduct those tasks. And we observe them while they conduct these tasks, and we keep track of where they seem to have difficulty and where they don't. Sometimes we'll even keep track of sort of quantitative data, things like what is their success rate or their failure rate, how long does it take them to complete a task successfully, etc. So that's the idea. Usability tests, there's 3 types that we'll talk about here. There's formative usability tests, and those are kind of exploratory in nature. That is, they're conducted early on in the design process, and those are the things that we do iteratively. That is, we do a formative usability test, then we will make changes to the design, then we'll do another formative usability test, then we'll make more changes, and we'll iterate on that a few times. Then there are having difficulty saying that word for some reason, let's try it again. Then there are summative usability tests, and you can think about that as a validation test. What we're trying to figure out there is this product ready to be released? Is it ready for prime time or not? And then sometimes it's always really helpful to know where our product stands in relation to our competition's products. Maybe we're designing a particular product and we want to make sure it's easier to use than our competition so that we sell more, for example. Well, in that case, we might do a comparison usability test. That is, participants would use our product and they'll use their product, and we'll keep track of the success and failure rates for our product versus theirs, the time required to complete the same tasks for our product versus theirs, their satisfaction at the end of completing all these tasks with our product versus theirs. That's a comparative or a comparison usability test. Okay, so here's the story behind usability testing. Usability testing really has just a few ingredients. 1, it includes representative users, real honest-to-goodness potential users of your product, and they perform real honest-to-goodness realistic tasks with your product or with a prototype. It's not, again, just asking them what they think. It's not saying, hey, does this look easy to use? It has less to do with their opinion and more to do with their performance when they're using this task, when they're conducting these tasks using this product. We'll keep track of some quantitative data like success and failure rates, the time to complete the task, the frequency of errors that they make, and then maybe more qualitative kinds of things like what kinds of assumptions and confusions do they run into, and what's their overall satisfaction with this. So that's an example of usability testing. It's focused much more on performance with the system than it is sort of people's discussion and kind of, opinions about the system. Okay. So here's a table that kind of shows the 3 types of usability tests and how they're used. As I mentioned, formative usability tests, or these exploratory ones, are really meant to identify usability problems so that we can go fix them. And in order to do that, boy, we could do this pretty early on in the design, even with low fidelity wireframes or prototypes. If it's a 3D product, for example, a real hard product, you could use paper foam and foam core and mimic some buttons that are on there. They tend to be a bit more qualitative than the other ones. That is, early on in the design, it might not make sense to see how long it takes for a person to complete a task. Instead, we might just want to watch and see if they do complete the task correctly, and then ask them later on about what was easy or what was difficult about it. Finally, it frequently uses a technique that we call think aloud. That is, we'll ask people to conduct a particular task and to sort of think out loud as they do it, almost like a stream of consciousness. Don't block, just tell me everything that's on your mind as you go through and do this. And this enables us to sort of keep track of what's on people's minds, what kind of confusion they have, what kind of misconceptions they have, etc. So that's what's going on during sort of formative or exploratory usability testing. Validation testing, on the other hand, we do that with a high fidelity system. We keep track of quantitative data, and the real reason behind doing this is we want to determine if the final product is ready to be released to public consumption or not. And as I described with comparison, we might want to compare 2 alternative designs that we're thinking of proceeding with. Or we might want to track usability progress over time. Let's imagine you have release, 2019, and then you have release 2020 and release 2021. It would be nice over time to find out that it's getting more and more usable and people are able to complete the same types of tasks just faster and more efficiently and happier than they did with each succeeding year. In that case, again, you could use low fidelity prototypes as you choose between alternative designs, or you could use high fidelity products or prototypes as you compare versions or competitive offerings. These two things tend to be quantitative, the summative and the comparison ones. Okay. Most usability tests are done as individual sessions. On the other hand, you usually have some observers and note takers in kind of tracking the data and so forth while you're conducting the usability test. And that is so that you can be kind of present and really focusing on the user while you're doing that kind of test. So let's talk about formative usability testing again. So formative usability testing, that's the exploratory type. When we're doing that, basically what we're doing is iteratively testing the usability of the product as it's being developed, because we want it to get better and better as we're working on it. Each test uses just a few people, and I'll describe why in a moment. That is, we don't have to do a giant usability test with 30 participants and all of that kind of business. And in fact, in some ways, at this point in development, that actually works against you. It's actually too much at that point. Also, often the participant is asked to think aloud, and looks like I cut off something here, but it's more qualitative and less quantitative. Maybe that's where I was going. I must have gotten interrupted during that. Okay, so how many participants should we be using in a formative test? So remember, formative tests, what we're trying to do is find the usability problems. And in order to do that, we don't need a huge number of people. So some of the original work in this area was done by Jakob Nielsen, who you may be familiar with, and another fellow named Tom Landauer, who was passed away relatively recently, but a wonderful cognitive psychologist. They developed a formula based on some research that they did, which indicated the number of usability issues found equaled this particular formula here, where N was the total number of usability problems that existed in the device or system. That is, imagine you knew totally how many were actually in there, and you wanted to know how many could be found with each participant. Well, imagine there was 100 in here. Well, N would be 100. So it's N times 1 minus lambda to the I. Lambda is the probability of finding the average usability problem when running a single subject. So what they found in their research is that each participant could find about 31% of the problems in a usability test. So what that means is, now if the first person found 31% of the problems, the second person comes along and they would find about 31% of the problems too, but some of them, of course, would be overlapping with what the first person found. So if we went up here and looked at our kind of curves here, imagine this was the first person. Well, this would be about the second person. So the cumulative number of problems found now is up around, instead of 31%, it's not double that, but it might be 52, 53%. If we went out here to the third person, well, again, cumulative number is starting to go up. It looks about, 67%. We get to 4 people, that's up by 75%. Get to 5 people, it's way up here by 78%. So you can see what's happening here is just with 30%, for each person finding 30% of the problems, we're getting what's called a curve of negative acceleration, or a curve of diminishing returns, to the point where you can see up around 8 or 9 users, we're already identifying something like 90% of the problems in that product. If we keep adding more and more users, well, we're not necessarily identifying more and more problems. We reach a point of diminishing returns. So the better approach to this, actually I here is the number of participants, the best approach here is to identify a good 80 or 90% of your problems, go off and fix them, and then come back and do another usability test with another 6 or 7 or 8 users and identify as many as you can that's left of those problems, and do that again and do that again. And in that way, you're much better off running, say, 3 groups of 6 participants or 4 groups of 6 participants than you are running 1 group of, say, 30 participants. Okay. Ooh, that was a long-winded way to describe that. Sorry about that. These things they're actually easier concepts than they are to talk about at times. But, okay, so I also mentioned thinking out loud. We also, during these formative tests, get a lot of value out of asking people to think out loud. And in fact, Nielsen mentioned in his 1993 book, Usability Engineering, that thinking aloud might be the single most valuable usability engineering method. And I'm inclined to agree with him. So what do? You ask a participant to use the product, to do some tasks, and ask them to just say what's on their mind the entire time they do it. Every once in a while, some people are really good at doing this. They kind of talk to themselves all the time naturally. Other people, not so much. So what you will probably end up doing is asking them to, talk, and you'll prompt them to remind them to talk when they stop doing so. But otherwise, once you give them the task, be quiet otherwise. It's called the shut up rule. And what this means is once you give that person that task, your job, because you're a nice, kind person, you think your job anyway, is to go in and kind of help them out where they get stuck. But if you help them out where they get stuck, you never really begin to understand, what got them stuck to begin with. You're much better off saying, I'm sorry, I can't help you, but show me what you would do if you were doing this on your own. That way they understand that you're not a mean person, you're just there to understand what would happen if you weren't there. There's some real benefits. Obviously, it helps you discover what people think about your design. It helps you figure out any misconceptions or misinterpretations. And it helps you figure out not only why people make mistakes, but how they try to fix those mistakes. Okay, so that's formative testing. That's exploratory testing. Now let's talk about summative or validation testing. Summative and validation testing is more formal. It is not meant to, like formative, to form the design. It's meant to assess or validate the design. So you start by, because it's kind of formal, you start by creating a real honest-to-goodness usability test plan. And in that, you'll use kind of a user profile so that you make sure you're selecting the correct participants who match that user profile. You'll identify the facility layout, you'll develop test materials, you'll create tasks, and you'll decide ahead of time what performance measures you're going to keep track of. Performance measures would include things like number of errors, time on task, success rate, etc. So let's discuss a little bit about this. Let's start with participant selection. You're going to want to use research participants who meet your user profile. That is, they'd be similar in age, you'd have roughly equal genders or genders that reflect the people who use your product, similar occupations, similar attitudes towards technology, perhaps similar learning styles, things like that. You basically want people who are going to look and act an awful lot like the people who are using your product. It's important that you avoid testing only the best users. What I mean by that is I've done work for companies previously, and an example is Microsoft. Microsoft is really careful about making sure that other people outside their company don't see their new products before they're released. You can see why they would want to do that. So what they'll end up doing is they'll offer gifts, basically, to employees to come in and test their products. It might be a free piece of software, any free piece of software they want, to come in and be a usability test participant for an hour or two. When they do that, they might ask managers around Microsoft to send participants from their group, to recommend people from their group to go and be usability test participants. Imagine you're a manager at Microsoft who are you going to send to kind of represent your department? Are you going to send your dumbest user, or are you going to send your smartest employee? Your dumbest employee, your smartest employee? Well, most of us are pretty interested in our reputations, especially when you're working at a big company like that. You're going to send somebody who represents you really well. And you're going to send your top employee, basically. Well, if you send your top employee at Microsoft, somebody like that can figure out just about anything, even if they're confronted with a terribly difficult to use user interface. So in that case, you're testing somebody who's really sharp, and now you find out that, well, yes, really sharp people can use our product. But how about the rest of the world? How good are they at using this product? Well, you might not find out because you never tested them. So go out of your way to make sure that you're getting all kinds of participants, not just the sharpest. In some of the products we design, for example, it's meant for a general population, not necessarily techie folks and so forth. So we'll go out of our way to make sure we also recruit people who are low in literacy, because it's a product that they would be using, perhaps a medical product, for example, and we're testing the instructions for use or the directions on how to use it. Yet a lot of these folks might have difficulty reading. We still need to test them. So you want to make sure you're testing not only the best users, but kind of the average users, all users, basically. Okay. These tasks that we're going to give people, we're going to assign people tasks to conduct, and then we're going to keep track of how they do when they're conducting them. When we're doing that, we're going to want to develop a task table. And the task table will list what are the tasks, what are the necessary materials we have to create, what are the success criteria, that is, how do we know that somebody has conducted the task correctly, and what's the maximum allowable amount of time that will let them continue in that task before we kind of save them from it, before we move on to the next task. So we develop that task table, and then we also develop scenarios which make that task realistic. So let's talk through that a little bit. Let's start by figuring out which tasks we should give people. Since a lot of products do an awful lot of things, you won't be able to test every set of tasks in every usability study that you do. So you're going to want to be smart about figuring out which tasks to test people on and which tests not to cover in a usability test. So I would start with ones that you think explore potential usability problems. So for example, sometimes as we're working on a product, we can tell that something might be difficult to use. We're not sure, but we have an inkling that this could be problematic. That's something you would want to test. Those include things that from your experience you just know might be difficult to do. The designers themselves, as they're working on these products, might identify some things that they're concerned might be a little difficult for people to use. Any tasks that tend to produce errors that are difficult to recover from, or that force you to lose data, you might want to test those. And any tasks when you're writing up your instructions or help system that seem to require a lot of explanation, those are often tasks that you want to make sure that you're usability testing to find out if they are needlessly complex. You also want to make sure that you are testing tasks that have been modified recently, that are frequent, that are really critical, or that might be conducted under time pressure. Those would be important tasks to test. You also want to think about the order in which you give these tasks. Now, typically in a usability test, especially if it's something procedural, we want to give those in kind of a natural order. So for example, if somebody's, creating a document first and editing a document second, and then printing a document third, etc., it might make sense to have people do those three things in a natural succession. Other times, however, you might want to do the most important task first. I'll give you an example. When I was working at HP, we worked on printers and things like that. Well, in that particular case, maybe I actually would want to give them a document and have them print it first as opposed to the other things. Well, why would I want to do that? Well, some participants take longer than others. And if I only have an hour and I'm mostly interested in how they print, then I want to make sure that I get that printing task done before all of the time runs out. That would be an example where you do that. Other times you might want to randomize or counterbalance your tasks. And you do that so that people don't learn from a first task and then suddenly are smarter about it when they conduct the second task, and even smarter still when they conduct the third. And we always think that that third task, that printing task, is really easy, when in fact, no, it's really not that easy. It's just that they learned from the creating and editing tasks, and they learned the system during that time point. So in that case, it might make more sense to make sure you're doing task A first, B second, C third, followed by the next participant doing task B first, C second, and A third, etc. Here's an example of a task table. If you think about it, it's really a miniature method section. That is, you've got your research question over here, a description of the task over here, the task details. This includes your materials that you'll need, how you know when somebody has completed something successfully versus not successfully, and the maximum amount of time you would want to give somebody. And here's the scenario. This is what the actual participant would see, and these are the measurements that we're going to keep track of. And I was just building out this table a little bit further with the next research question and the next task, etc. And you would have several of these in here. So why in the world do we use scenarios if we've got these tasks? And the idea here is what we're really looking for is to provide some context for the task so it feels realistic to people. When we do this, we want to make sure we're providing the information necessary for people to complete the task. We want to make it as realistic as possible. We want it to say, exactly what it needs to and nothing more. And then this sort of column on our right is just some good rules of thumb for writing a good scenario. Make sure you're using very simple language, brief sentences, consistent language. Give a reason for conducting the scenario, etc. And I'll have you look through that at your leisure. There are also performance measures we want to keep track of. So remember, performance measures tell you how the participant is actually performing with your system, with your user interface. So some ones that I mentioned before, task completion time would be one. These are time measures. Time to find information in the manual or locate information, that's a pretty important one. If it takes you forever to find the information, you'll probably stop looking for the information. There's success measures, percent of people who actually complete the task correctly in the reasonable amount of time. Or error measures, for example, the number of times the user incorrectly selects the menu item X instead of the menu item Y. These are kind of performance measures that are quantitative in nature and usually pretty helpful. There's also some satisfaction measures that you could come up with ahead of time. How many times during the period when they're thinking out loud do they kind of mention negative comments like, this sucks, or wow, I thought it would be easier than this, or I can't figure out where I am. Each one of those are kind of negative comments, and you could just, every time you hear one of those, make a little tick mark and count up the frequency with which they've said those. There will be ease of use ratings, preference ratings, comments and quotes, and things like that. Okay. There are also a number of both post-task questionnaires. So after a person finishes a task, you might ask them about that specific task. And then there are post-test questionnaires. Once they've finished the whole usability test, you might administer a usability questionnaire then. Often you'll create these on your own, but there are some standardized ones out there that are worth taking a look at. The most common one is called the System Usability Scale. And while it's not ideal by any means, there's really not an ideal usability scale out there. And the System Usability Scale has kind of the most data associated with it. So that's one that's kind of the go-to or a bit of a default scale. But there's a number of others. There's the PSUQ, and there's a whole bunch of others that are described here in a book, short book by Philip Kortum about usability assessment. There's two other books I should mention. I probably should have written them down here. There's one by an old friend who passed away recently, named Tom Tullis, and that is something like measuring the user experience, and that's by Tom Tullis and Bill Albert. And then there's another one by Jeff Soro called Quantifying the User Experience. And both of these would be pretty helpful for you to read when you're thinking about usability scales and so forth. An important part, I kind of alluded to this before, an important part of this is making sure you don't run out of time when people are conducting these tasks. So what I mean by that is, each one of these take a certain period of time, and sometimes we underestimate exactly how long they'll take. So consider how long it would take an experienced user to complete the task, and maybe do something like double that amount of time when you think about a novice conducting the task. Think about what problems the users might encounter while they're actually doing the task, how long it would take a user, to recover from expected errors. Think about how much time is needed to set up the task and how much time you think it would be. So I think one of the things that I like to remind people of is that it could take a fair amount of time just to brief the user. What I mean by that is kind of introduce them to what this study is all about, put them at ease and so forth. It could take some time to provide instructions, to answer questions, to fill out pre-test and post-test questionnaires, and debrief the user to give them an idea of what that study was all about and make sure they don't have any additional questions. So that stuff takes time, and I think lots of times, especially novices, people who are pretty new to this, forget that it takes that much time and find themselves really watching the clock pretty darn closely. Okay, how about the facility? How about the environment in which you're going to do this? I think the most important part is to kind of recreate the context of use, so that if you're making a device that's going to be used in a surgical suite, you will make your facility look quite a bit like a surgical suite. If it's being used in an office environment, well, it'll look like an office environment. If it's a home environment, it might look like somebody's living room. Also, make sure that the users are comfortable. People tend to get nervous during this time, and when they're nervous, of course, we've got all kinds of extraneous neural firing going on, and people aren't particularly good at their job when they're particularly nervous. I would also make sure you establish rules for observers. That is, observers love to come in and see what users are doing, but they also tend to get distracted and talk to each other and catch up and so forth. Sometimes they can be downright loud. You don't want that to happen. In fact, we have some example observation room guidelines over here that we use at Research Collective. Feel free to use those in your own work. And then there's issues just associated with the camera. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but here's an example of what a facility might look like. Okay, so let me give you just a few additional hints for successful usability tests. It's really important that the participant feels comfortable, that they feel wanted and respected, and that they feel like they are your expert, because that's exactly what's happening. We're trying to understand them, and they're just kind enough to conduct some tasks while we try to understand how they interact with our product. Make sure you develop scenarios that make the tasks realistic. Make sure you do this by developing an easy-to-follow task table and moderator's guide. This is really helpful for your observers to understand. Make sure you have enough time for each session. Make sure that you remain calm and objective, because if they see you getting uptight, well, the participant tends to get uptight too. Make sure you build rapport and define responsibilities with your note taker and the observers, of course. Make sure you pilot test. And what I mean by that is work out the bugs in your own testing method. So sometimes you'll ask a question, for example, that isn't a really sensible question. It just is awkwardly worded. And when that's the case, well, the participant's trying to understand what you just asked of them and has difficulty in the task. Well, it might not be a problem of the product that you're testing at all. It simply might be a problem with your materials or the way you ask the question. And that's why you pilot test. You do that to work out the bugs in your own system, but you also do it so that you work out the bugs in the materials too. Then finally, let me mention kind of the top 5 mistakes that I've seen when people do usability tests. One is to just give a demo and then ask people what they think about that demo afterwards. There are times in your product development process where you will want to give a demo. For example, you want to give a demo to your boss, or you'll want to give a demo when you're trying to get additional funding for future development. That's fine. But it has just the opposite purpose of doing a usability test. When you give a demo, you're often trying to show people how wonderful your product is. When you're doing a usability test, you're trying to identify all the places where your product is not wonderful so you can go back and fix them. So those are 2 different things. What you want to do is make sure that the user is actually doing tasks and that you're identifying where they're having difficulty. Think about it as looking for trouble. You're trying to figure out where that person is having trouble with your product. I would avoid at all possible, if at all possible, avoid developers and engineers testing their own products, simply because they know their products too darn well. I would make sure that you don't only select the best participants. I would make sure that you always pilot test and always make sure you identify the successful task completion criteria so that you know what the person needs to do in order to be completely, to have successfully completed the task. Well, I hope you find this helpful and enjoy doing some usability testing, and I look forward to talking to you during the next video.